Imagine lying back in your chair on a Sunday evening and taking a deep breath, or lighting a cigarette on your balcony while sipping your coffee. It feels as if all the stress of the modern world is drifting away in that single puff of smoke. Now let's rewind a bit. Not too far, just about 30 or 40,000 years. You're in the pitch-black darkness of night. There are no streetlights, nor any concrete walls to protect you, just a crackling campfire and the sounds of wild animals coming from the thickets. And sitting in the corner of the cave is our friend Grug. Grug has had a terrible day. He was nearly trampled by a bison while trying to hunt. The rest of the tribe is angry with him, and his stomach is growling. His stress level is on par with a Monday morning in a modern office building. To calm down, Grug tosses some random dry plants into the fire. His only goal is to keep the fire going. But wait, what's this? The smoke rising from the leaves that fall into the fire carries a sharp yet strangely soothing scent to his nose, one he's never experienced before. Grug inhales the smoke. A few seconds later, his eyes widen slightly, and he feels the heavy burden on his shoulders lift. It is at that very moment that humanity's millennia-long love story with smoke began. But wait, Grug hasn't rolled a cigarette yet. In fact, there's no filter, no tobacco leaf, and no lighter in sight. There are only mysterious plants thrown into the fire and the smoke from those plants that soothes the soul. But how did this love of smoke turn into those little white sticks we carry in our pockets? Could the origin of the world's most dangerous and most popular habit actually have been a survival strategy? Grug got a taste of the smoke, but there was a major problem. Our lungs aren't biologically designed to breathe in smoke. Evolutionarily speaking, smoke meant fire, and fire was a deadly danger you had to run from. Yet ancient humans were strange creatures, strange enough to recognize the reward hidden in that deadly danger. So when did that famous plant we call tobacco make its debut? Hint, much earlier than you might think. Grug and his tribe realized that smoke didn't just relax the mind, it also kept those massive blood-sucking mosquitoes at bay. In other words, smoke was initially less about pleasure and more like a prehistoric mosquito repellent. But does the human brain ever stop? Once they caught a whiff of that sense of relaxation, they started setting fire to every plant they came across to experiment. And it was during one of these trial-and-error sessions that another of our ancestors, wandering the vast lands of the American continent, came across a green, broad-leaved plant, tobacco. Archaeologists have discovered that people were using tobacco seeds as far back as 12,300 years ago, even at the end of the Ice Age. In other words, even before agriculture existed, people were already on the trail of tobacco. Of course, back then they weren't smoking it like a filterless cigarette. The first method was simple, chewing the tobacco or throwing it directly into the fire to fill the room with smoke from the burning tobacco leaves in the center. Imagine the whole tribe crammed into a small cave, living as if inside a cloud of smoke from the burning tobacco leaves in the center. So why were they doing this? Because that famous substance in tobacco, nicotine, was actually a toxin the plant produced to protect itself from insects. The plant had developed this chemical to paralyze the caterpillars that ate it. But in a strange twist of evolution, when this insecticide reached the ancient human brain, it created a completely different effect, a dopamine rush. When Grug chewed the plant or inhaled its smoke, he suddenly felt more focused, stronger, and better able to withstand hunger. Did he need to stay alert while hunting? Chewing a piece of tobacco leaf was enough. But the dark side of this miraculous plant would soon emerge. For the invisible chain we call addiction had already been fastened around humanity's wrists. Tobacco was no longer just a means of relaxation, it was a way to connect with invisible worlds. As our ancestors watched the smoke rise toward the sky, they began to think of it as a message to the gods, a bridge. It was precisely during this period that a more effective way of drawing the smoke directly into the lungs was discovered. But this discovery didn't come in packages like it does today. As time went on, humanity realized that simply throwing tobacco into the fire was a bit of a waste. The smoke needed to be absorbed directly into the body without being wasted. That's when someone spotted a hollow reed on the ground, a hollowed-out bone, or a piece of wood. They wrapped tobacco leaves around one end, placed the other end against their mouth, and lit it. Congratulations! Humanity had invented the first prototype of the cigarette and the pipe. However, back then, this act wasn't just something ordinary people did while waiting for the morning bus or escaping work stress. Smoking tobacco was practically a ticket to another dimension. Shamans and the tribe's sorcerers began smoking pure tobacco through these tubes, tobacco far stronger than any ordinary person could endure. In fact, sometimes they inhaled the smoke so deeply that they began to hallucinate and faint from nicotine poisoning. When they opened their eyes, they would say, "I spoke with the gods. They told me where the hunt would be tomorrow." In other words, the smoke was a sacred means of communication. Whenever a peace treaty was to be made between tribes or a major decision was to be made, the famous peace pipe was brought out. Everyone took a deep drag from the pipe in turn and released the smoke into the sky. This signified, "Our smoke has mingled in the sky. We are now brothers." The strange thing is that ancient people didn't view tobacco merely as a spiritual tool. They believed it was a cure-all. Do you have a toothache? Blow some tobacco smoke on it. Are you hungry? Chew some tobacco to curb your appetite. Or have you suffered a cut or bruise? Crush some tobacco leaves and wrap them around the wound. In a way, they were right because nicotine alleviated pain and provided a temporary energy boost. But what they didn't know was that this seemingly friendly plant was actually slowly enslaving them. For centuries, this ritual continued on its own in the Americas, in harmony with nature. Grug and his descendants respected tobacco, using it only on special occasions. But when the calendar read 1492, large wooden ships from across the ocean docked on this mysterious continent, and humanity's relationship with smoke was about to spiral out of control, never to be the same again.
When Christopher Columbus and his men set foot on the American continent, they did not quite understand why the indigenous people welcomed them so warmly and presented them with dried leaves. In fact, Columbus wrote in his journal that he thought these leaves were useless and threw them into the sea. However, a few curious sailors on the crew noticed that the indigenous people were smoking these leaves through pipes and exhaling smoke from their mouths. "Let's give it a try and see what happens," they said, and inhaled the smoke. And at that very moment, it wasn't just the sailors who had secured their ticket back to Europe. Addiction had also stowed away on that ship as a stowaway. A sailor named Rodrigo de Geddes, on returning to Spain, began walking down the street with smoke billowing from his mouth. The townspeople who saw this were horrified. "The devil has possessed this man. Fire from hell is coming out of his mouth," they cried, and they reported him to the Inquisition, leading to Rodrigo's imprisonment. But ironically, when Rodrigo was released from prison 7 years later, nearly all of Spain was already smoking tobacco. What they had called the devil's invention had suddenly become the greatest luxury of the aristocracy. Tobacco sparked such a craze in Europe that people began calling it the holy herb or the miracle of India. The French ambassador Jean Nicot, the man after whom nicotine is named, presented this plant to the Queen of France to cure her headaches. Before long, tobacco became a medicine prescribed for the plague, coughs, and even dizziness. People inhaled the smoke to heal themselves. The more they inhaled, the more they became addicted, and the more addicted they became, the more they sought a cure. A perfect vicious cycle had been established. However, tobacco was still expensive, and rolling the leaves or cleaning pipes was a hassle, until the late 1800s. Just as the Industrial Revolution changed everything, it also brought about the mass production of tobacco. An inventor named James Bonsack invented a machine that could roll hundreds of cigarettes per minute. Gone was the shaman's sacred pipe. In its place came millions of small white sticks, cheap, practical and easily slipped into a pocket, produced in factories. Smoke was no longer a sacred ritual, but the modern world's fastest-moving consumer good. That innocent adventure Grug had embarked on to scare away flies and stay alert while hunting had now turned into a massive multi-billion-dollar industry in humanity's greatest health crisis. So, what was the common thread between that man sitting by the cave fire thousands of years ago and the modern person who stops at every street corner today to take a drag? Why do we still seek refuge in that smoke?
When you look at that pack of 20 sticks you buy at the store today, you're actually holding the final link in a chain of evolutionary traps and survival struggles spanning thousands of years. Modern medicine has proven time and again that smoking kills, destroys our lungs, and rots us from the inside out. We all know this, yet we continue to inhale that smoke. Do you know why? Because our brains are still living in that ancient cave. We come from an evolutionary past that knew nothing of chronic stress. For ancient humans, stress was fleeting. A line would appear, you'd run or fight, and the stress would be over. Today, there are no lions, but there are never-ending bills, your boss's endless emails, traffic, and the vague anxiety about the future. Under this constant pressure, our brains are at a loss, and right at that moment, that old friend, nicotine, steps onto the scene, triggering a dopamine release in a matter of milliseconds. It sends a false, "you're safe, everything's fine" signal to the brain. The most ironic part is this. Most people who smoke today don't actually love the cigarette itself. They love the little moment they've created around it. When you step outside, overwhelmed by work, you're actually creating your own little escape, much like Grug fleeing that noisy tribe to retreat to a quiet corner of the cave. That little puff of smoke in your hand gives you permission to pause the world, even just for a few minutes. Looking back, we see that the story of smoke is actually one and the same as the story of humanity. It's the story of that strange creature, us, who despite knowing the danger, succumbs to curiosity, who tries to bend nature to cover up their weaknesses, but who ultimately becomes a slave to the very invention they created. The next time you watch a wisp of smoke drifting into the air, don't just see the burning plant leaves within it. See the shadow of our ancient friend Grug, who 30,000 years ago clung to fire out of fear of the darkness, sought ways to ease his stress, and hasn't changed much since that day. Because despite the thousands of years that have passed, the shifting continents and the massive cities that have been built, we are still those same ancient people sitting around that campfire, just wanting to find a little peace. And we must admit that the bond between us and our ancestors is much deeper than we realize.